I'm here with Steve Finney, who's a medical doctor and an expert in low-carb nutrition, and the author of a book on the subject called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living. So, welcome.
Thank you.
So, what is low carb? How do you do it? How do you do it long term? That's your area of expertise, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you have any tips for my viewers?
Yes. I've been very interested in how humans adapt to low carbohydrate diets.
Yeah.
And there are multiple phases and forms of adaptation. Of course, there's the fact that you have to give up something that's sweet or it's delicious or it's a food that you eat, and those are behavioral adaptations. And those do occur. But my interest has been how the human body adapts. And if I've made one contribution over the last few decades of my research, it's demonstrating that the full adaptation, when one takes most of the carbs out of the diet, requires at least 2 weeks and probably more like 4 to 6 weeks of staying continuously low carb without interruption for the body to fully undergo adaptation to what I call nutritional ketosis.
Right.
And so the term we've developed for that is what we call keto adaptation.
Yeah.
And if one undergoes keto adaptation, the body's fuel use fundamentally changes. And the most obvious aspect of that is that one has much easier access to body fat stores, basically to the large fuel tank that we carry with us. And even a lean person such as yourself will carry tens of thousands of calories of fat in body fat stores, but only 1,000 or 2,000 calories is glycogen. So by keto adapting, you actually get access to, ready and easy access to your much larger reserves of fuel. And if one is overweight, which neither you are nor I are at this point, if one's overweight, it makes it much more feasible to lose the extra weight and get down to a lean body weight.
Right, of course, yeah.
But then the question is, okay, if somebody goes on a low carb diet, goes in and gets carbohydrates under 50 grams per day, which is really the threshold to get where the body goes into ketosis. You change the fuel flow in the body to optimize fat mobilization and fat utilization. And the question is that I've struggled with, and it's taken me some time to figure this out, is how do people stay on this long term?
Right, that's a very good question. I'm sure a lot of my viewers are wondering, how do you do it?
And
is it hard?
It's a little more complex than just not eating carbohydrate. Now, in order to maintain this optimum access to body fat fuel, one needs to, in essence, stay in a ketogenic state. And the benefits of nutritional ketosis are quite simply the fact that the brain has a continuous supply of fuel. You don't go through highs and lows of fuel, which when the fuel supply goes low, the brain gets anxious and tells you go eat. That's cravings or hunger.
That's what's happening on a low carb, on a high carb diet.
On a high carb diet, or even intermittent doses of carb. So one of the messages is, in order to do low carb long term, you have to stay low carb. You can't have holidays. You can't take a day or a weekend. Sometimes people break the diet and then restart. But if you have a 1-day break, it takes 2 to 4 weeks to readapt.
Really?
And you learn very quickly, by not feeling well, not functioning well, that it's better to stay on it than to take the occasional holiday and then pay the price of having to go through the readaptation process.
Yeah, but the adaptation, the first time you get into ketosis, could take days or weeks to adapt. But isn't it faster if you just take a short break and go back? Like the next time, isn't the adaptation quicker if you just took a short, like you said, holiday from the diet and you eat some carbs for a few days and then you go back on the low carb ketogenic diet?
That's an excellent question that hasn't been adequately studied with objective research. But in my clinical practice, which I did for 25 years of working with people on carb restricted diets, if they took a weekend off, when we measured ketone levels in the blood, it took at least a week to 2 weeks to come back up to the new stable state. So the body, our analogy is that being in a keto adaptive state is like living on the top of a steep sand dune. Okay? It's very hard to climb up. But once
Oh,
you
yeah?
climb up and you get on top, you're stable. It's easy to stay there.
Yeah.
But if you slide back down, it's a hard climb back up again.
And you've been on the top of that for a long time now, I think.
Over the last 3 decades, I had done intermittent periods of just self-experimentation. But for most of the last 7 years, and particularly 6 years continuously,
Yeah.
I have been on a very strict low carbohydrate diet. I get between 25 and 50 grams of carbs per day, about 5% of my energy.
Okay.
And so I've remained in nutritional ketosis continuously for that period.
Yeah. You've written a book about this and everything. And what are your best tips for people to make it easier to stay on this for a long time? What's important to think about?
That's a very good question, because figuring out how to make this kind of diet sustainable is the key to being on it long term, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple key points. One of them is when one is first on a low carbohydrate diet and losing weight, a fair amount of the energy that's burned each day comes from body fat stores.
Mm-hmm.
But once a person gets to a new healthy weight, if they want to stay on in the keto adapted state, they cannot add more carbohydrate.
No.
They should eat protein in moderation, because high protein intakes reduce ketones, not as efficiently as carbohydrates reduce ketones, but still, if you get up above 2 or above 30% of energy as protein, you're no longer in a ketogenic state.
Okay.
So in order to have a weight stable ketogenic diet, it must be a high fat diet.
Right.
And in my case, I eat between 75 and 80% of my daily energy comes from fat.
Right. And I think that's a very good point, because many people think of the Atkins diet or other low carb diets as high protein, low carbohydrate diets, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not quite true, in your opinion.
That's correct. When you look at the induction phase of Atkins, which is the first, when someone first starts on the diet, for somebody who intends to lose weight, they might eat 1,400 calories per day.
Right.
But
they burn a lot of fat.
burning twice as many calories per day. For a heavy male might burn 2,800 calories a day. So
and the rest is body fat.
So the rest, the other half is coming from body fat. So when you look at what that person eats, what's on the plate, if the person's eating 1,400 calories and 600 or 800 calories of that comes from protein,
right,
that looks like it's a half protein diet.
But it's not really.
And so it looks high protein, but that's only what the mouth sees. What the body is seeing is a moderate protein intake, because the mouth isn't seeing the half that's coming from inside.
Yeah.
But once you get to maintenance means you're not burning any more body fat. And that requires that all of the fat that you are burning each day, whether it's 3/4 of your energy intake, has to come from the outside.
So what happens if you do a low carb, high protein diet and you lose a lot of weight, burning a lot of body fat? What happens when you approach that new steady state, when you stop burning body fat? If you keep eating low carb, high protein and not a lot of fat, what happens?
Well, if you do the math, you would have to eat a whole lot of protein.
Yeah.
So if
so
let's say I'm burning 2,800 calories per day, and I want to eat half of that as protein, that's 1,400 calories per day as protein.
That's a lot of meat.
That's A, it's very expensive,
Yeah.
and B, at that level of protein intake, many people feel sick. And it causes gastrointestinal upset and weakness and fatigue. And that level of protein protects your body from being in ketosis, which means now you've lost your easy access to body fat stores. So you've allowed protein to become a metabolic impediment to block your access to fat. So you can't add in protein. And if you're so afraid of fat you won't add in fat, you'll just keep on losing weight until you become wasted.
Okay.
So
but then you're going to be hungry too, right?
And then you're hungry.
So perhaps.
So to make a sustainable low carbohydrate diet satiating means you're satisfied.
Right.
And provide the right mix of fuel so that you keep making ketones, which keeps feeding the brain, so your body doesn't need all that carbohydrate that the standard nutritionists say you have to have. Then you have to keep protein moderate, you have to keep carbs low, and the only other source of energy is fat. So when we look at Aboriginal cultures, and I've gone back to look at
you're an expert on that subject.
What do hunters, what do herders, people who are nomadic shepherds, who
Like
don't
Maasai.
stay in any one location long enough to grow a crop, and who live in environments, for instance, like the Inuit in the Arctic, where there were no harvestable, no gatherable carbohydrate foods.
Right, because it's too cold.
It's too cold. They don't grow there.
Right.
So either they choose not to gather carbohydrate-containing foods like the Maasai in Central Eastern Africa, who were a pure nomadic herding culture, or if you look at the Inuit in the Arctic, who had no choice but to eat from only meat and fat.
Right.
When you look at both those cultures, they treasured fat and they ate their protein in moderation. It's fascinating that people still think that the Inuit ate a high-protein diet, but when you look at what the people who lived up, what literate people who lived among the Inuit and wrote down what they did.
Yeah.
When the Inuit killed a caribou,
Right.
and they did hunt on the land, they didn't just fish and spear seals, but they went inland to hunt caribou in the fall when the caribou were fat.
Okay. Yeah.
So they timed the hunt for when the animal's body were rich in body fat. When they killed the caribou, the lean parts were reserved to feed the dogs.
Right.
Remember, they had dogs that pulled the sleds.
Okay.
Dogs are very well adapted to burning a high protein diet. Humans are not. And so they would divide the food into the high fat foods for the humans and the high proteins, the things we call roasts and steaks,
Yeah.
the things that are treasured in our culture were
That's
dog
for
food
that's
for
dog
the Inuit.
food. Okay.
And their
Well, that's
wisdom,
different.
their world was different. They lived in a high fat diet. The fat
So that's
was
necessary
required
as
for the
they don't
humans.
have the carbs to eat to
Exactly.
burn for energy.
And so they, without being a scientific or literate people, they culturally developed the wisdom to know
Discovered
how to
what worked,
partition the foods to the animals that were their beasts of burden and the assistants in hunting, the dogs, and they saved the fat for themselves. And when we look at what the Inuit ate, they ate something approaching what I am, because I've modeled my diet after the reports of Arctic explorers.
Right.
They were eating 75 to 85% of their calories as fat. They had very little carbohydrate, less than I eat, so they got about 15% protein and less than 5% carbs in their diet.
Interesting. Because the conventional wisdom today is that wild meat is supposed to be low fat, right? High protein.
Yes.
No?
Yep, grass-fed and so on.
Yeah.
And-
but
and-
isn't it true that the grass-fed meat tends to be lower in fat?
Yes, it is. It is, because they are not in a feedlot and not fed the starches that
Right.
put fat on the animal, just like we do. But in the wild, at specific times of the season, grazing animals would go through natural cycles of accruing fat. And so
Yeah.
the female and male caribou in the Arctic, when grazing on the summer forage in the lush green of the Arctic summer, remember the sun is, the sun
Yeah.
is out for
Yeah,
20,
sure.
22 hours a day.
Midnight sun.
And so the grass grows well, they gorge on that, they eat a lot of it, and they build up body fat.
Yeah.
And the Inuit timed their hunting in the late summer, early fall
Right.
to kill the animals when they were the
When they're
fattest.
fat.
They saved the fat.
How do you save fat without making it go bad?
Well, in late August,
even for spring.
even in late August, the nights, they start having frosts.
Okay.
So as long as you keep the fat out of the sun and store it away from where animals will find it, the fat, by late August, early September, the average daytime temperature is like a refrigerator.
Really.
And
Okay.
by October, they're having snow. So it's frozen. So if they time the hunt to kill the animals just before the change in season,
So they have like a freezer.
they have what they call a cache. Either they built it out of logs, very heavy logs on the ground, so it couldn't be marauded by wolves and polar bears, or they built it on very high stilts that the animals couldn't climb up and put their food up there. And they would put the fish that they catch in the fall, and they put the fat and some of the meat.
Yeah.
And so their method of storing fat was to time the hunt and have it be frozen.
All right.
Further south in the United States and in central Canada on the plains, we had 60 million buffalo. And we had
Right.
many different cultures of hunters, what we call Native Americans, what the Canadians call First Nations people, what the
Right.
people in Canada, they call themselves First Nations.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would hunt the buffalo when they were fat in the fall. And when the animal had been killed, they would cut the lean meat in strips and hang it up and dry it, air dry it,
Right.
and keep the fat. And the air drying of the meat took about 3 days. Once it was dried, they, meaning the women who did all this work, would pound the meat on a flattened piece of wood with a wooden mallet. They pound the meat to make it soft. This is dried meat. They pound it, make it soft, put it inside a buffalo skin sack. And then they would take the fat that they'd saved, heat it up to melt it, and they'd pour the hot fat in on top of this mass of pounded dried meat. And when the fat was still hot, they would use the sinew from the tendons and they would sew the sack closed. Now these are ruminant animals. The fat has high saturated fat content and it's solid. It solidifies at environmental temperatures. And so when they're done, they've got this skin sack.
Big
Typically,
sack of
it would weigh between maybe 20 and 40 kilograms total.
So it's huge, huh?
Big. 20 to 40 kilograms is enough is a weight that one person could carry. A child could carry 20 kilograms. A woman could carry 40 kilograms. And when they traveled, they could carry this food. It was called pemmican. And when you look at the composition of their original pemmican, which was just meat and fat, they did not add berries or grains or other things.
No berries?
When the English came, the English were used to pudding. And pudding was a fat and meat and fruit mixture. So when the English controlled the pemmican trade, they asked for and got a different composition. But what the First Nations Native Americans were making was something which would have a very long shelf life. Because they would make this is their reserve food. The pemmican was something that they wanted to be able to keep. Sometimes they could keep it for more than a year and travel with it. And the thing that made it so efficient as a food was that 1 pound of pemmican could feed a sedentary person for a day. So if you were in camp waiting for the weather to change, waiting for the season to change, you could live on 1 pound an adult could live on 1 pound of pemmican a day and stay healthy.
Easily, huh? If it's mostly fat, then it should be like, what, 4,000 calories? Or?
It would be with the protein. You'd get about 100 grams of protein and about 3,000 total calories from a pound. So if you're not working hard, if you're not walking great distances, then a pound a day was enough to support you. So if a family, they hunted in small groups and they killed a couple buffalo, they would stay around the site of the kill. The dogs and the people would eat the fresh parts while they were making the pemmican. And when they broke camp and left, they would be carrying with them maybe 2 to 3 weeks food supply. So they didn't have to kill another animal the next day. They could go for weeks between kills.
So if you only eat pemmican, don't you get lack of vitamin C? Or?
See, don't you develop scurvy? That's the fascinating question. And we don't have a good enough answer for that. We do know that eating fresh meat and fat does not cause scurvy. And that was the result of an experiment done at Bellevue Hospital in 1928. It was the so-called Stefansson experiment. And Stefansson
what, 2 persons?
That was 2 persons, but they had lived, Stefansson and Anderson, Karsten Anderson, who was one of Stefansson's colleagues, who was a geologist who traveled with him in the Arctic for 2 years. They lived for, Karsten for 2 years and Stefansson for over 5 years, continuously lived on a meat and fat diet with no berries, no fruit, no vegetables.
But don't they get berries like in the summer?
Well, if you go inland and hunt for lingonberries, you might be able to find them, or cloudberries. But they didn't do that. The Inuit ate very little gathered food. That was their culture. And they somehow figured out that they could live on that. And that raises the question, is vitamin C required in higher amounts because we eat a lot of carbohydrate? We know that now that carbohydrates increase the body's level of oxidative stress. And maybe we need much more vitamin C when we're eating carbohydrates under the carbohydrate-induced level of oxidative stress. That's a hypothesis. It's not been proven. But it is a fact that explorers of non-Inuit origin, European explorers, lived on the Inuit diet and didn't develop scurvy. But if they lived on the diet of the preserved foods they brought with them, salted meat, ship's biscuit, dried peas, then if they ate that for more than 4 months, they would develop signs of scurvy.
Like seamen?
Like the English sailors, which may have been a reason for the demise of the Franklin expedition in the Arctic in the mid-1800s. But that's getting kind of esoteric.
Maybe.
Let's come back to the maintenance
Right.
issue, because the
Right.
other key
High-fat diet.
other key factor is if one accepts the fact that one can live well on a high-fat, moderate protein diet.
Yeah.
The final question is what kind of fat?
Yeah.
And when you look at what people around the world who had a choice of which fats to eat when they ate a high-fat diet, they tended to choose fats that were rich in saturated fats and rich in monounsaturated fats. Among the Inuit, if they had a choice of caribou fat or seal fat,
Yeah.
they'd eat the caribou fat for food and use the seal fat as fuel for their lamps.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
the Inuit, in the winter they lived in igloos,
Yeah.
either on the
Right.
on the shore or on the ice, and they didn't have access to wood. So what did they use for fuel? And they used liquid seal fat
Seal fat.
as
okay.
as the source of
Polyunsaturated,
very
like
high in
omega-3.
polyunsaturates, liquid at low temperatures. Now, if they didn't have caribou fat, they ate seal. And they would take seal fat and they'd put it in skin bladders and carry it with them. But they liked to eat a variety of fats, not just one. And they did not treasure the seal fat for food as much as they treasured the caribou fat.
Interesting.
And then they had choices. We now know that when a person is keto adapted, that is, has gone through this
Right.
process of allowing the body to optimize fat for fuel, one of the changes that occurs is that saturated fats are no longer accumulated. Saturated fats become the body's preferred first line fuel. So
Okay.
if you think of fats in the body lining up to get burned, at the head of the line, when you're keto adapted, your body chooses to burn the saturated fats.
Okay.
So even if you're eating, say, caribou fat, in the case of the Inuit, or me in the case of my eating butter, which I like to eat some of every day, that the saturated fats don't accumulate in the body because they're rapidly oxidized and selectively rapidly oxidized. So that means it's okay to eat some saturated fat. So if you have fat on a piece of beef, you don't cut it away. It's a
Sure.
delicious part of the food.
Sure.
But the other factor is that although each of us humans needs some of the essential fats each day, that's both the omega-6 and
Right.
omega-3,
Yeah.
those requirements, those essential fat requirements are very modest.
Yeah.
And if you're eating 80% of your calories or 75% of your calories as fat,
it's
like
hard
I
to
do,
get the lack of
you
any
don't
fat.
need that much as
No.
a percentage.
No.
So I eat a very low percentage of omega-6, which can be pro-inflammatory if one eats too much. I get more than the minimum requirement for omega-3, but I don't have to emphasize eating omega-3, and I certainly don't want to emphasize eating omega-6.
So what kind of food do you eat
Well,
mostly?
in the fats that I choose
Yeah.
olive oil,
Olive oil?
and
Sure.
I choose a form of safflower that's recently come into the market called high oleic safflower. That's a form of safflower that's rich in monounsaturates and
Right.
doesn't contain a lot of omega-6 polyunsaturates.
Right.
And then I eat the naturally occurring fats in the meat and fish and poultry that I consume in moderation. And I eat some butter. I enjoy cheese. There are wonderful, delicious cheeses
course,
that one does not need to avoid because, again, the saturated fats are now my body's first line fuel.
Sure. Do you know that, talking about the high-fat diet, in Sweden, we call the low-carb diet, or Atkins-like diets, we call it LCHF, meaning low-carb, high-fat.
And
What
that's
do
a
you
very
think about that?
that's a very accurate term.
Yeah, because the protein, I mean, you get a lot of protein if you eat real food, right? Like meat and fish, so you don't really have to worry about that. Just keep the carbs low and fill up with fat until you're satisfied, right?
Yes. And satisfaction is the key. I don't count how much fat I eat. I
No.
just eat to be satisfied.
Sure.
And for 6 years now, my weight has been not perfectly, but very stable. And I don't
Cool.
change how much I eat. It's a natural regulation of intake that the human over a period of evolution has had thousands of years
Yeah, right.
to perfect.
And you even got off some blood pressure medication, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
When I was
I
on
see
a
that
carbohydrate-containing
quite
diet,
often.
even a DASH diet, my blood pressure was in a range where it needed to be medicated. When I stay on a ketogenic diet, I have a low normal blood pressure.
Yeah, congratulations.
It
neat.
seems like it's the normal state for my body. But
Yeah.
again, my ancestors came from the part of the world that you come from.
They did?
Well, the
Yeah.
name Finny, the root of the name Finny is Finn.
Ah,
And
so
so when you look in
your
Ireland
ancestors are
or
from Finland, huh?
when you look in
Okay.
Ireland or in Normandy or in Great Britain, the person whose name is Finn was someone from the north.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
So no.
Yeah. That's interesting. So anyway, to wrap it up, the tips for maintaining low carb for a long time is fill up with fat. And
Is-
choose saturated and monounsaturated fats primarily.
Yes, keep carbs low.
Keep the carbs low.
Keep yourself at a range where you stay in nutritional ketosis, which allows the body to have a free flow of fat fuel to all organs in the body.
Right.
To satisfy oneself by eating moderate protein, high fat, and make sure that you eat the right kind of fats, which is stay away from the liquid vegetable oils that are rich in omega-6s, emphasize those that have high monounsaturated, like olive oil or high oleic safflower, or possibly even canola oils.
All right.
And then eat a variety of, if you wish, for taste and for variation, eat a variety of low carbohydrate vegetables. And I even, in my 25 to 50 grams of carb intake per day, I find room for berries. If I have 100 grams of blueberries or raspberries or blackberries, I have that with cream. Makes a delicious dessert. And so that one can have even a small amount of berry fruit in the daily diet, and that gives an opportunity for excellent variety.
Nice. Thinking about your book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, who should read this book?
Well, originally, Dr. Volek, who's my co-author from the
Right.
University of Connecticut, we planned to write it for physicians.
Right.
But as we were writing it, we realized that most physicians have no major background, no significant background in nutrition.
Right.
And so we found ourselves writing it at the entry level for a well-educated, smart person, but somebody who
Right.
hadn't had previous coursework in nutrition. And we realized that means it has crossover appeal to and the educated non-medical person. And so
Right.
if someone's curious about low carbohydrate diet and they're willing to accept a little bit of technical material in the book, it's accessible to the educated lay public as well as to the healthcare professional.
Right. So curious and smart people can read it. They should read it.
I would recommend it, yes.
Yeah, I recommend it too. It's a good book.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot for the interview.
Andreas, it's been a delight answering your questions, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.